if I could give some advice to a younger version of myself, it would be to somehow encourage a positive autistic identity.
She was born in Somalia, and in the 90s, her family came to Australia. And so she was living in these two worlds, at home, and then in multicultural Melbourne. She really got to see a lot of diversity, but regardless of who she was with, she always felt like the other.
Yeah, I think, but for the difficulties that I have experienced for a lifetime in healthcare contexts, I could have lived my whole life never knowing that I am autistic. And a GP who was genuinely trying, his first words to me was, "Sadly, I don't have an injection to cure your autism," not understanding that my autism is integral to what and who I am. And for every difficulty it's caused me in life, it's also given me immense strength.
Okay, welcome everybody to our Less Diagnosed Autistic Women panel discussion. It's a pleasure to join you. And the outline for our panel discussion is we're going to have two late diagnosed autistic women, Dawn and Nadia. And Nadia will be spoken on behalf of Taro. And Taro will speak about Nadia's experience. We felt that we wanted to do a late diagnosed autistic women panel because the best way to understand autism is to meet autistic people and listen to their experiences. And Autism from the Inside wants to feature a diverse group of people on the spectrum to help the world understand autism, and specifically late diagnosed autistic women. So the two questions that we've posed this evening are, what is your autism diagnosis, experience and story? And what we'd like other people to know about autism. So just moving on, I will give a brief introduction and overview. I'm Shannan Lea from Autism from the Inside. Bit of a reflection on my autism diagnosis. A statement from a researcher about autism, whether it's a deficit, a difference, or both, said that many autistic people struggle with difficulties associated with being autistic, viewing difference as a lonely experience of not belonging. From my early childhood, I certainly felt different. I wasn't quite sure what that difference was. I think it was very hard for me to distill that down. But I certainly did notice that I was different from my peers. I felt quite ashamed of how and frustrated with my inconsistent focus and my energy and coping with loud and vibrant and chaotic environments. I also felt really frustrated because I seemed to have a boom or bust cycle of really pushing myself and then needing recovery time. And I know that Christine Migrandino refers to this as spoon theory. And I was constantly frustrated just by my unreliable spoon count and trying to explain to others why sometimes I had many, many spoons and sometimes I didn't seem to have any. I really felt like a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together but was created for a 3D model. And so somehow the architect or the designer or creator hadn't told the pieces how to fit together. Was the best way I could kind of describe it. I struggled pursuing a diagnostic assessment, even though my son was diagnosed at the age of 2, because my autism felt very different from my son's autism and also his father's autism as well. And I felt anxious about being autistic enough. I think one of the challenges with being diagnosed as a woman is that autism presents differently, or perhaps the diagnostic criteria is gendered, or perhaps a combination of both. And so I was concerned about seeking a diagnosis because I was concerned whether or not I was autistic enough to be part of the autistic community, or neurodivergent enough to stand aside from the neurotypical community. And I feared both acceptance and rejection, not knowing quite where to fit in. And that was my catalyst for looking for a formal diagnosis. And I received that in December 2023. So I am officially autistic and with a number of co-occurring conditions. So that's a little bit of an introduction about me. I'd now like to warmly welcome our panelists. We have Dawn and Tile representing Nadia. And just want to give a little bit of an introduction about Dawn. Dawn has a background as a trainer and learning and development manager in the public service. She's also doing ad hoc work and is an autism expert by experience with local authorities and a healthcare trust, and worked on some campaigns for the National Autistic Society, the Now I Know campaign and upcoming In Our Words project, both of which are incredibly exciting. So Dawn says that her main focus is on autistic people's access to healthcare and prevention of misdiagnosis or unidentified autistic women. And autistic women enable them to recognize themselves that they could be autistic in the first place. So welcome, Dawn. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And I'd now like to welcome you, in your own words, to talk about your experience of being diagnosed as autistic.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here, actually. I think, but for the difficulties that I have experienced for a lifetime in healthcare contexts, I could have lived my whole life never knowing that I am autistic. Certainly I can echo your experience of being that little bit different my whole life. I've had the usual stories of playground bullying and not knowing how to do it is when I was younger. But it kind of makes you a bit independent. I certainly accepted my quirks. My friends would say of me, you're quirky, but we love you. And I would have thought no more of that, except this awareness that I had this bunch of peculiarities, if you like. But the one thing that has caused me lifetime trauma was the medical context. I have, I mean, they haven't gone away anyway, but I call them something different now. Lifelong fears of both my own body and doctors' health procedures and all the rest of it. And this had started to get worse as I got older. I can remember there being a mention of a doctor's appointment when I was young, striking the fear of God into me, being absolutely terrified of going, being just paralysed with fear in doctor surgeries. And of course, as you transition to adulthood, nobody's going to speak for you. You need to do that for yourself. I could never quite communicate what was wrong to doctors. I couldn't find the words. There were endless conversations about, well, is it this sort of pain or that sort of pain? I'm going, I don't know. I'm trying to describe it in the best way I can. Relationships with doctors became very fractious. Words themselves would trigger those anxieties, words for certain body parts. Certainly my anxiety would be crescendoing while I was sitting in waiting rooms. This got worse and worse and worse. And certainly as a child, I'd had teary meltdowns, a few as a an adult, but there were various difficulties along the way to precede the whole thing. But I reached a point in about 2019 where, after many attempts to get some therapy for these so-called phobias that had failed and failed and failed again, the last attempt through mental health services coincided with the extraction of some teeth. And all of a sudden, there were these wall-thumping, effing and blinding meltdowns that were just driven by sheer terror in that context. And it just got worse. They were trying to put dentures in my mouth. It would just trigger. So the pre-seed version is, in all of that, I end up under the care of mental health services who, without my knowledge, had slapped an EUPD diagnosis on my file. That's unstable emotional personality disorder.
Okay.
And I think they got to that conclusion because they are listening for people in emotional distress. They kept talking about working on deep emotions. I'm telling them I have this deep emotion. It's called terror. I'm terrified in there.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I can see that very often autistic people's sensory experiences and autistic reactions to those sensory experiences are often misunderstood as something relational. There's something wrong with your relationships with people. They think it's manipulation, that you're just putting it on. I know people may or may not be familiar with the Oliver McGowan story in the UK. We've now got some mandatory training, but he was a young man who was autistic and had learning disabilities as well. When he had those very same reactions in a medical context, was administered antipsychotic medication and sent off to a mental institution where it was recognised he was not mentally ill, taken off of the medication, but he'd had an adverse reaction. And sure enough, there's another episode where he's had seizures, he's taken into hospital, and despite the notes on his file, was given antipsychotics again, and it killed him. And his behaviours within that context were consistently misunderstood as something he was just doing to wind up staff. It wasn't understood, even though they knew that he was autistic. And I think there's a parallel there to what an awful lot of women go through, because my story is not unusual, not by any stretch of the imagination. I've met autistic woman after autistic woman who has had this diagnosis, sometimes of other things, but most commonly EUPD, because the services have not recognised that they are autistic and are misinterpreting the behaviours that they see in front of them. The individual then becomes more and more frustrated with services because they're blaming them for the struggles that they face. In my own case, we got to a point where I really could not cope anymore. I did not wish to be on the planet anymore. I couldn't go on in this space of constant terror, not knowing what was wrong with me, inverted commas, or why I was experiencing what I was experiencing within that context. But I didn't give up. I mean, the services by this time had just washed their hands off me, never having told me that this diagnosis was on file, and that is what they were trying to treat all the way along. No wonder things turned out the way they did. But I didn't give up. I took it upon myself, actually, as a sort of last desperate attempt to research what the baseline issue could be. I was researching everything phobia related. And I came across a piece of research about medical phobias in autistic children. And that was kind of the only clue I'd had. I put myself through all of the quizzes from the reputable websites, the ones used by clinicians for a whole range of diagnoses. And other than my anxiety scores being off the Richter scale, just nothing was matching me or my emotional landscape. And that, incidentally, I put myself through the personality disorder once, and that this is scoring nothing on there. I'm reading blogs of people who self-harm, and my heart was just breaking for the people who were writing them. But I didn't recognize anything in their emotional landscape matching my experience. But the one thing I'd been hopping over again and again and again that had been flushing up in almost every search that I did were the pages of the National Autistic Society. And when I finally clicked on, I was about to give up, and when I finally clicked on one, almost by accident, there was this descriptor of shutdown and meltdown. And when I dug into the childhood indicators in particular, there was sensory issue after sensory issue after sensory issue. And I realized that this was mapping my experience from the earliest outset, or the weirdy food things I'd had as a child, such that my diet was so restricted. A roast Sunday dinner stinks to high heaven for me. The fact that I can't coordinate, I was rubbish at sport, I can't ride a bike, I can't drive a car because I'm also dyslexic, and those try to do it in a reverse mirror is nigh on impossible for me. All my clothing issues, everything was there. And I just sat there almost in tears thinking, but of course, a medical context, what have you got going on in there? The lights and the smells, and my brain was just firing at a rate of knots. But this means, but this means, but this means. And I realized that my problem was neurological and never, ever had been psychological in its origin. Now causing some psychological spill out because I'm traumatized by all the doctors that never believed my pain threshold as a child, who ignored my distress because they couldn't see why I was making a fuss. But I realized that I was having an experience that was different from other people's, and that they could not have known any more than I could have known. And that is what had created this immense trauma decades down the line. It had been building up over a lifetime. And yet I was still scratching my head, because just like everybody else out there, our image of what an autistic person looks like is the one the media pumps at us, Rain Man. This is what we imagine. And I'm thinking, communication deficit? What communication deficit? I have a degree in modern foreign languages. Excuse me. I am a trainer. How have I got a communication deficit? But then I remembered my first day at school, and I remembered walking into that classroom expecting to be taught to read at a little desk day one, and I couldn't understand what the children were doing around me. What was that dressing up box about? Why weren't they sitting down all disciplined at a desk? And playtime, and we're made to go outside, and these kids are running around. And I just stood on the doorstep waiting to be let into the classroom again. The bullying later on in school because I didn't fit in. And the stories from my mother flooding back about my own linguistic development, that how I had stared as a baby at people's mouths, trying to copy the lip movements, but refusing to speak with an audience. And my mother would say every time a word came out of my mouth and it was precocious, it was accurate first time, but not in front of her. She'd left the room and then I was talking to the animals on my wallpaper. And because I've studied child linguistic development, I knew that that was not the normal pattern. I'd always assumed my mother had had it wrong, but she didn't. She remembered accurately. So my driver had not been interaction with other people. My driver had been, I must achieve this task because the people around me can do it, and I will practice until it's perfect, and then I'll think about speaking to them. So suddenly this stuff started to make sense. I self-referred for a diagnosis, and it was the National Autistic Society who diagnosed me. And I was very well aware that given this awful history with mental health services, that whoever I went to had to know their stuff. I didn't want anybody questioning it afterwards. And I really did want somebody who would understand the presentation in women. And it was, so I was 56 by this stage. This is November 2021. It was the January afterwards where it slipped out in a doctor's letter that this diagnosis of EUPD existed. And it then cost me an arm and a leg to source professionals expert in both to interrogate me and conclude that I did not have a personality disorder, and prove to them that that was the case so that they would correct the record. But clearly my relationship with general medical staff had deteriorated in the meantime, and all of a sudden I can understand why. Because there are these awful labels attached to personality disorders, that they're generally manipulative, that they want to split teams, that, histrionic tantrums, all the rest of it. And I've come out of this, I think, with a good deal of compassion for anybody who might genuinely have that diagnosis, because the responses of services toward them is pretty awful. But the bottom line is they had mistaken my autistic reactions to a particular context for something else entirely. And I'm here, and all of a sudden now the autistic world is opened up to me. I'm participating on forums, I'm interacting with other autistic people, and my story is nothing special. I'm hearing it again and again and again and again and again. Meanwhile, I still have to access general health care, and it still proves a nightmare. There are some improvements now that the doctors can understand that I'm autistic, that my communication with them will be different, that I might go into shutdown. You hope not meltdown, although it has happened, that I might have difficulties expressing things in the way that they can understand, that I am going to experience very high levels of anxiety. They need to send me in for tests or procedures. But still, they don't entirely get it. I mean, a GP who was genuinely trying, his first words to me was, "Sadly, I don't have an injection to cure your autism." Not understanding that my autism is integral to what and who I am. And for every difficulty it's caused me in life, it's also given me immense strength. And that I would not wish to be born any other way. I am who I am because I am autistic, and actually I live quite comfortably with who I am. So that is the pre-seed version of my story. But it's left me with a huge passion for improving the access of autistic people to general healthcare, because our healthcare outcomes are not good. I never thought I'd meet another individual who had the same experiences in a healthcare setting, and yet there I am on the forums, and I'm hearing almost everybody express at least some degree of the problems that I face, even as much as, you've got to ring the receptionist to make an appointment. And because we've got very often co-occurring health conditions, we perhaps have more need to go to doctors. There's a delay in getting diagnosed, and so on and so forth. So our lives are shorter. We have poorer health outcomes, and we really need to do something about that for health inequalities. But the other thing I'm really, really passionate about is the re-education of psychological services. I find it quite astounding, really, that in 2019, nobody that I encountered could have said to me, Dawn, have you considered the possibility you might be autistic? And as I look back over all of my interactions with them, the clues were there again and again and again and again. And they missed them all. They not only missed them all, but they misinterpreted them all. I am forgiving of the services in as much as they were not adequately trained and missed the clues. I am not forgiving of the blame the patient culture at all. And it's left me with an awful lot of trauma and mistrust of those services now. So it's to be hoped I never do genuinely need them, because I know I can't go back there. I can't trust them. And I guess the one little thing I will mention at this point that kind of illustrates the depth of the way they can re-traumatize or cause trauma when they do get it wrong, concern my relationship with my mother. I don't know why they always wanted to talk about this. But because I've worked with people dealing with looked after children, I know about attachment disorders, and I was saying, well, yeah, I never seemed to need my mother much as a kid. I didn't remember many hugs from her, but she recently said something interesting to me. She said, as a tiny baby, I seemed not to want to be hugged, and I seemed to want my own company. So she had given me my own space. Actually, my mother did exactly the right thing for an autistic baby who didn't want to be overpowered physically and who liked to entertain herself. But I couldn't even get through, and I couldn't make this match up with this attachment thing, because no one had ever been cruel to me. I never felt anxious when my mother wasn't there. I kind of saw there was, but it didn't match. And I couldn't even get through that line of thinking with this therapist, because as soon as I mentioned the comments that my mother had made, she said, but Dawn, can't you see that's abusive? I said, but my mother wasn't abusive. And she actively rolled her eyes. And I'm later told, I just won't work at it. So it becomes traumatizing. You know you aren't being listened to. You know you aren't being taken seriously. And I couldn't understand why. And clearly it's because she got an EUPD diagnosis sitting on file that was inaccurate. Now, as you reframe that question, there was one of the major, and there were many, major clues that they could have picked up on. I was a baby who did not want to be overpowered with hugs and preferred to entertain myself. What kind of baby? I can remember saying to her, what kind of baby reacts like that? And your answer is an autistic one. So there you go. That's the proceed version, and that's the reasoning for my two areas of focus, if you like.
Dawn, could I just thank you so genuinely for sharing those experiences and your story. There was so much that resonated with, again, the autistic community that I've had the privilege of talking to, and my own experience of initial diagnosis of anxiety and depression. And then the focus then becomes on, for want of a better word, willpower, or your core values or personality, as though somehow the way you're interacting with and processing the world is something you can choose. And it was such an aha moment for me to realize that, firstly, not everybody interacted with the world the same way that I did, but not only that, there is no element of choice in an autistic profile. It's not a matter of reconceptualizing something or redirecting your personal values or changing the narrative that comes to you naturally. And it is very hard to share that in a way that is visible. And your story just spoke in so many ways. And interestingly, as well as personally as a parent of a young man on the spectrum, how important it became for me to be the parent that he needed and not the parent that I envisaged myself being and wanted as part of my parenting identity. I wanted a very chatty, interactive, social, engaging. I desperately wanted to share all of my passions and experience and do all of the things I envisaged doing as a parent before I met the young man that I have the privilege of being a parent to. And then I realized that that's not what he needs. And I need to be brave enough to parent him in the way that supports and loves and accepts him for who he is and makes him most comfortable. And I think that was part of my inspiration for working with Paul for Autism from the Inside. Was I wanted to make the world more autism friendly, but I wanted to make myself more autism friendly. I wanted to understand what it was that he needed and what he was communicating and why. And it was one of the driving forces, again, behind my change in career as well, to do that. But thank you so much for sharing your story. And now I'd like to introduce our second panelist, and then at the end we'll have a little bit of a discussion about our stories and our common themes. But I'd now like to welcome our second panelist, Nadia. So Nadia is a very accomplished artist through mixed media, installations, performance. She uses those mediums to explore the link between past and present and the weaving of stories of identity, resilience and transformation. So Nadia was inspired by a sense of belonging to a heritage from which she was once uprooted. So Nadia's work invites others to reflect on their own connections to place, to culture and to change. Nadia is a DJ and theatre maker. She believes that art should be accessible to all, and her projects are often creative expression of everyday life. She collaborates with schools and community groups and women's organisations in Melbourne, which is Nam country, to ensure that young people and women, especially those on the fringes, can explore art, culture and a joy of creative self-expression. And I would now like to introduce Tare. So Labo Tare is a man on a mission to help heal the world from the damages of patriarchy. And now that he's finally clued into how devastating it is, today he's standing in for full-time Somali women like Nadia, who juggle full-time jobs, at least 3 side hustles, a shitload of kids. They single-handedly and lovingly raise into hopefully decent human beings. I share that goal. And by stepping up, Tare is giving these incredible women a tiny bit of relief, because it's one thing less on their overflowing plates, that he can be their spokesperson. So welcome, Tare.
Oh. Yes. I think you had me muted there. That was a lovely introduction. Yes, I feel very privileged to be here. How would you like me to proceed? Would you just like me to speak to the notes that we have there?
Yeah. You're welcome to speak to the notes, but if you feel inspired to share the journey or highlight different things, you are very welcome.
Okay.
And whatever inspires you to share or to share Nadia's story.
Yes, thank you. And because I know Nadia very well, we have had many and very lengthy discussions. Sometimes I forget that I'm talking about her, not myself. So I might say but really I always mean Nadia. Now that I have gotten that out of the way, it really is wonderful to be here speaking to you both. And thank you, Dawn, for continuing to be curious, so therefore not giving up. And thank you, Shannan, for sharing your experiences also, both myself as Tare, T-A-R-R-E apostrophe, and Nadia. I think we have in common a passion for good parenting, and I look forward to speaking about that, maybe if it comes up. So for Nadia, I think what she said was she always knew she was a bit of a wonderful weirdo, and like Dawn was saying, was very not aware as such, but was an observant of her difference when put next to, for example, her peers, her siblings, and she was never without comparisons, because she comes from a very big family, so she had ample opportunity to constantly be observing her difference, her weirdness, as she has always known until she was later diagnosed. So it's one of the things Nadia says was very confusing for her was the fact that she felt odd because she grew up, she was born in Somalia, and in the 90s her family came to Australia, and so she was living in these two worlds, at home and then in multicultural Melbourne. So she really got to see a lot of diversity, but regardless of who she was with, she always felt like the other. And the reason for that is because she was, how do I say, she had a high threshold for what some people would consider embarrassing. She was, to blunt, some people call it, but it was her way of getting the things that she saw as not being worth dancing around out of the way so she could enjoy the things she enjoys. So she would tell a stranger that they have, in fact, something on their nose that maybe needs to be removed. And it's not to embarrass, but to just say, hey, I know you would not like that on your face. It doesn't bother me. It's just a social thing. It's expected, so I'm telling you. And that's that. She has found that some people were, appreciated this, while others found it confronting. And that was endlessly confusing for her. When you're a person of color and you live in a majority, because we are all racialized, white, black, etc. If you're, for example, a black person and you live in a majority white place, you will feel like the other racially, because you're in a racialized body, because race is a made up thing, but we're all in our categories. And in those categories, if you're with black people, they will say, well, this is what white people do. And then when you're with white people say, this is what white people do. And I was constantly being, for lack of a better word, accused of being either too white or, because I was punctual, on time, organized, and it was confusing because why is that white? It's just called having standards, is that right? And so that was always very confusing for Nadia. Asking questions. Nadia recalls being, very young. Some of her first memories are about asking questions, then asking questions about the answers that were given to those questions. And, this is her memory of herself, even before coming to Australia. So one of the other things that was very challenging for Nadia is when white people said to her that you're only feminist because you grew up in Australia. Again, Nadia surprisingly has some strengths in terms of memory and about some weird things that most people don't remember. And that includes just, again, encountering sexist or misogynist things as children, as a child, and her thinking to herself, well, that doesn't seem right? So this has been Nadia's experience, and eventually over time, Nadia has come to see family, because again, like she said, she has a big family. She has come to categorize people into biological family or logical family. And obviously, the logical family are the ones who, accept and appreciate the difference, which is what, you're kind of forced into when you're, autistic or neurodivergent. Even when you have these sensitivities to, sensory things, or, a certain, attraction to echolalia, or, repetition, or repulsion from it, you can still understand, that it's a thing, even if you don't want it for yourself. But I think what Nadia has found is her neurodivergence has made her, on the one hand, it was a challenge, but on the other hand, it taught her that the constant consideration of the fact that there is this world that is for the neurotypical, and these other possibilities which neurodivergent people are experiencing, there are different perspectives, and that we all indeed see the sun from our point of view, And even when Nadia has experienced intolerance and just downright disrespect at times, she could consider the fact that this person who was doing this, not making excuses for bad behavior or anything, but they were seeing things from a completely different perspective. And even if, you would say something about their bad behavior, bad treatment, understanding it for the person who's having to experience that bad behavior from someone else makes it more bearable. So, the other thing I think Nadia would like me to add here is that as a way of perhaps communicating her knowledge of neurodivergence by way of giving an analogy, she likens being autistic or neurodivergent to maybe, funnily enough, an experience that has been better understood, which is when people are migrants, you come to a new place, it's confusing, and you are constantly having to adjust, readjust, learn, relearn, and constantly pivot. But eventually, most migrants come to settle in their new homeland, and they adjust. But Nadia likens her experience of being autistic in the world as never adjusting and constantly needing to understand, learn, relearn new things, new language, new ways of understanding human interaction. And I think, I'm going to maybe start finishing up so we can start having back and forths, which I really enjoy. But I think, in bringing in a little bit of Nadia and I's first language, which is the Somali language, for us, I think being neurodivergent, I'm going to use lots of mixed metaphors here and say that it is like, oftentimes, how do I say this? We say, think outside the box. Think outside the box. But what Nadia has told me is that that whole thing, is, of course, it's easy to think outside the box because it is when you don't think in boxes and your thoughts and your thinking and the possibilities of life are, boxed in that way. And in this way, I would like to, I think, on behalf of Nadia, share with you a Somali, word or concept, and that is, banani. So the word for freedom can be interpreted as a, brain that's outdoorsy, and in conclusion, let your brain be an outdoorsy kind of brain, because it's truly freeing and a fun way to be. Yes. Thank you very much.
Tare, thank you so much for sharing Nadia's story. I was particularly taken with the idea of meeting you, Tare, and speaking on behalf of Nadia because I thought it was such a different interpretation of masking. It's a creative mask that you can utilize to your advantage, to be able to focus on something from one perspective and viewpoint, and to be able to talk about it authoritatively without questioning a narrative. And I was just so excited that you were happy to join the panel and to be able to present Nadia's story through Tare. So thank you so much for sharing your insights. It is, and I love the let your brain be an outdoorsy brain. I think one of the common themes that I heard throughout the narratives of all of our diagnosis stories was certainly a resilience, but a deep desire to understand, to find out what was happening, to work out and not accept a misdiagnosis, or to not accept racism or prejudice or any of those cultural contexts, and to challenge all of that with a deeper understanding of self and what it is to be neurodivergent. So I always enjoy listening to other autistic women. If you could speak to other autistic women, what would you like to share, or what would you like to encourage?
Well, I can speak to Nadia about the fact that she's done a lot of actually research to a wonderful organization. It's called Positive Partnerships, and through that work, she's been working with them for the last maybe 9 years. She has engaged with many women who are raising autistic children, but also, a lot of young women who are in her community who, for lack of a better word or better way of putting it, I will say they are the way I would put it, and I think that you would agree here, is that they don't have the time or I hesitate to call it, but the luxury of seeking a diagnosis. Because oftentimes, as it was shared in my bio, the women, particularly of her community, but similar communities, migrants, etc., there is often an expectation, and it's not always, coercion or a bad thing. It's just cultural to have children early and to have a good number, although that is changing across the board everywhere in the world. People are having less children. But women who are of Nadia and I's background often do not have time to scratch themselves over the lifetime of, especially the adult lifetime, because they will often get married young and start having children. And as anyone who's had children or anyone who's thought about it could tell you, once you have children, they take over every part of your life. You really don't have time to scratch yourself. And if you have multiple, that time is even lessened. So unfortunately, there are a lot of women who end up being affected by you could call it diagnosis, but you can also just call it an acknowledgement of your difference. That absence of the acknowledgement of your needs as a neurodivergent person, the lack of acknowledgement gets to the person, and it often leads to the person having some kind of a burnout or breakdown. And this is something that happens. So what would I say? Oftentimes, Nadia would say to young women, for example, or people who, maybe their area of learning or education is in some, more, I don't know, sciencey or accounting, so you're not doing the humanities or the health sort of learning. So the head will not be there. If I do meet women like this, what I tend to do is I'm constantly talking about neurodivergence anyway, and I am a bit of a weirdo. I'm always offering unsolicited advice. I never tell anyone that they're autistic or not, but I talk about, or Nadia, I should say, talks about her autism quite a lot and normalizes it, because Nadia also, like yourself, Shannan, has a late teens son who, she had to ensure felt that his mother understood him and understood what it meant to be neurodivergent, and also to create a community that accepted and understood him as a neurodivergent person. So in doing all of those things over the years, Nadia naturally finds herself talking about being neurodivergent as an everyday thing. She likes tea, she likes coffee, she likes all the drinks, but she also likes talking about being a neurodivergent person. It just comes into the conversation. Yes.
I think that's fantastic of Nadia and Tare to both introduce that into the conversation, because I agree that those first images of Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man are not representative of the autistic community at all.
I'm very bad at maths, and Nadia is too. So, it's a genius thing. It was very confusing for Nadia because although she definitely has identified her strengths early on, and especially having a father who was the auditor at the Central Bank of Somalia, so very good at the maths, it was very puzzling for him to have a daughter like Nadia, who it turns out has a dyscalculia. Lucky she lives in 2025 with all the, computers and the calculators. But having said that, although she has dyscalculia, which is just being very bad at numbers, this is the thing about being a neurodivergent person. On the one hand, you're bad at numbers, but on the other hand, you count in twos. You can't count in ones. If you could count in threes and fives, even better. But it's always a different kind of a relationship with whatever topic in question to the neurotypical person that makes us neurodivergent. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. And Dawn, is there something that you'd like to say to any women who are perhaps over the age of 35 and wondering if neurodivergence applies to them?
Yeah, it's an entirely personal question, isn't it, as to whether or not you want to go for a diagnosis, and that's a whole other issue. I think on that score, my primary concern would be, are the materials out there to allow people to recognize that they could be autistic or they could have some other form of neurodivergence. A lady called Jane McNeice, whose books that I much enjoyed, has pointed out that in order for us to get to this point, three things have to be true. We have to have an acute sense of self-awareness. We have to be actively looking for answers. That much is within us. But the final piece of the puzzle is in the exterior world, is the information there to enable us to recognize that this could apply to us. So it's to the individual really as to whether or not they want to just self-recognize or whether they want to be identified formally as an autistic person. But for anyone who has trodden that journey and found the truth at the end of the day, I think the one thing I would like to say is you have a voice. You have a voice. It deserves to be heard. I'm picking up on much of what Clare has said about language and learning a new language. I think we have a right to expect to not entirely have to use the language that is other than our own. And I thought that was such an important point, Tara, because, my background is languages, and I know if you've got Chinese person and French person in a room, whose responsibility is it to accommodate to the others such that communication can happen? And I think anybody would agree without hesitation, it's both. You either find a lingua franca or you try and learn something of the other person's language. I think we have a right to speak on a language. We spend our whole life masking and trying to speak the language of the people around us. I think it is also their responsibility to understand language as we use it, such that we can find this common ground. And that is what doesn't happen. We've raised the issue of change as well. And one thing that was in my medical notes, I saw a couple of times, we have failed to change her. I never asked the services to change me. The only thing I wanted to change was the problem I was having in a medical context, the level of anxiety I was experiencing. But again and again and again, my communication has not been understood. So, yes, the message is you've got a voice. You've a right to have it heard. Yes, we need to respect the predominant neurotypes mode of communication, but they need to respect ours.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think it's an immense relief when you realize that you're not in deficit, you're different. But the other thing that I felt that Tare really brought to the fore was difference in perspective. I think that's what society, this is why I'd say to any other autistic woman, you've got a right to a voice. Because society is missing out on our voice. We've got difference of perspective to bring, that thinking out of the box, precisely that. And I think that's absolutely invaluable in all sorts of contexts.
Yeah. Yes. And can I just say thank you, Don, and your cat's, is that a cat's jacket there, Shannan? It's great. I want one. Send me the link for that fabric. Look, what I'd like to add to what Don was saying, and I think Nadia would agree, because we talked about this a lot, is, Nadia's father said to her, if you meet someone and they don't share your language, and if they learn your language, it means they love you. And I say that as a way of saying that when humans, they like each other, and someone has a heavy accent, but if you like them, you will adjust your hearing so you can understand the person. And one of the things that Nadia talks about when she's done work with this organization, she mentioned the positive partnerships. And she spoke to usually parents of autistic children. Is what they say is that, how do I put it? I think I just lost my train of thought there. But when so I understand what I was going to say now. One mother who had a autistic child who had other, coexisting disability, she said that because her child did not look visibly disabled, she felt some discomfort in taking her child to a specialist school. But then she said that she felt bad afterward, after reflecting, because she said it's not just that disabled children, and this is getting onto the topic of should we have separate schools and should everything be separate. She said it's not just important for the disabled children to be around, non-disabled children, whatever, but it's also important for, children that don't have any disabilities or are neurotypical, understand how to be with difference. Yes, and this is where you can say about language, you can say about cultures, you can say about refugee experience, you can say about religion, all of this. So, the thing about the perspectives, I think when you're autistic or neurodivergent, you're forced into thinking about these things. But when a young person, for example, doesn't learn about difference, that's when they say things that are insensitive, whether it's to a disabled person or a person who is of color or etc. So, Dawn, I want to acknowledge that what you were saying is very important, in that we do need to see more, readily available learnings around what it means to be autistic, and that it means all sorts of things, and it means that the world is not made for neurodivergent people. So look for the atypicality and go, hey, welcome.
Agreed, absolutely, Tare. It's that visibility and that acceptance. I think I was thinking about my autistic diagnosis, and if I could give some advice to a younger version of myself, it would be to somehow encourage a positive autistic identity, because I think I experienced a lot of othering, and I was quirky, or I'm precocious with my language, and I think often that was perceived as confidence, when in reality there was a great deal of anxiety and a lack of feeling confident, really at their core, and a constant questioning of what was going on and what was happening and how I was being perceived. And I think that whether a formal diagnosis or a self-diagnosis or an understanding or realization of neurodivergence, the one gift that it's given me is one of compassion. And I noticed that Tare mentioned that as well. And I know that Dawn has expressed that with all of the autistic stories that she's heard, is that compassion of trauma and struggle and difference and othering, and understanding that we are constantly trying to fit into a neurotypical world, and that we have self-expectations that are based on a version of the world that we're not a part of. And I think that, again, it comes down to that language and learning that neurodiverse language and seeing the world through that neurodiverse lens and celebrating that neurodiverse lens, not necessarily looking at a diagnostic report and identifying deficits, but identifying differences. And some of them create incredible advantages and things to be celebrated. And some of them do cause significant challenges. But also understanding that even if it is a formal diagnosis, it's a snapshot in time. I look at my son's neurodiverse diagnostic report, and there were questions about his education. There were questions about if he would speak. There were concerns about whether he would make friends. And I remember the first time we got 6 birthday invitations in 3 months. And I thought, look, it's not right. The diagnostic report and forecasting isn't right. But in some ways it was. It did speak to his neurodivergent learning curve, but it didn't predict the outcomes. And I think that was one of the things that I took greatly to heart, was that the snapshot in time is not a forecast for the future. And there, amongst all the things we have, is we do have agency, and we may perceive the world differently. We may experience the world differently. But we can also advocate and be proud and be inclusive and make visible. And I think those things are what will make the next generation of late diagnosed autistic women, or hopefully maybe not diagnosed autistic women, understand that their place is very valuable and very important and should be protected and celebrated. I'd now like to open up any kind of closing remarks or any questions.
I'll just add that one of the things that Nadia is very excited about with regard to having more visibility in terms of learning is the organization she's working for. They produce lots of resources in different languages, and very pleased. They're very pleased with the work that they've done with mostly the big languages, Chinese, Spanish, Vietnamese, etc. But also the materials that they're developing, not just for teachers but also parents. Short videos. Nadia's been working with them to produce things like radio plays, rather than creating brochures and this sort of thing, which doesn't take into consideration a lot of people's relationship with the written text. Videos and other accessible learning tools. So it's good to know. It's very good to know that there are services, even though we are let down by certain health professionals, etc. That there's some good materials coming out. Yes.
It's fantastic. I'd officially like to thank our panelists today for sharing their autism lived experience and for sharing it publicly with you. And I would like to give my heartfelt thanks to Dawn and Nadia and Tare for sharing their experience as late diagnosed autistic women.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure.